I would draw your attention to Steve Ressler, who is coming to the homecoming brunch. He is the founder of GovLoop, and if you don't know GovLoop, you might want to check them out, especially if you're interested in the Presidential Management Fellowship. They have sort of a guide too, and so he might be a good person for you to talk to if you're interested in Washington and all things Washington. All right, so some very enjoyable readings. You're welcome. Today. Okay, so what's left? So next week we have, I just talked about, or just the first line is your international comparisons of education policy, which you'll be doing next week. Next week you'll want to start seriously thinking about who you want to interview in DC. You'll see that at that point it will be 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks out. By October 30th, you really want to have that nailed down and you want to be sending those emails. So on October 30th, as part of class, you'll be meeting in small groups to sort of bounce your ideas off of Dr. Shogun. And she may give you some ideas about who you might want to be interviewing, and I can do the same thing. So we'll sort of do that in 2 different groups.
And so I know, and this is mainly for the rest of the class.
Sorry. RSVP for the bus.
I was just about to say
You
that.
really need to do that. If you have not done that, you need to email Katie and RSVP for the bus, because she suspects that some of you have not.
You remind me.
If we plan on staying in DC for the weekend, do we
Just
need to
let her know that.
Okay.
So she'll know how many people, like, is she waiting for somebody, or is there another question? So, Dr. Shogun should send you on your way nicely in terms of getting ready for your legislative proposal. We have a lunch at noon in Steitler, so we will not be here right at 1 o'clock, but I strongly encourage you to come here at 1 o'clock so that you can start talking about your policy proposals in your group so that you have something more coherent to say to her. Okay? Yes, good. Class 10, pretty straightforward. I know it says conclusions, but that's because that's sort of the last lecture class. Okay, after that, we go to DC, and then we have presentations. Please note, this is the day you'll be presenting on. You might want to write that down. One other fairly significant change is you're going to be so busy with this and then this that if the exam was actually on this day, you wouldn't have a lot of time to prepare for the exam. So we're going to do a review session on that day, and we'll push the exam to December 10th. If anyone has a problem with that later date, come see me. Okay? Working on the tech support guys, I think there's a way for you to use your laptop to type your test, and it blocks the internet, so it is still a closed book test. If you don't bring a laptop, whatever, you can borrow one, or you can do it in paper. But my past experience is 3 hours of writing longhand is more than most of you are accustomed to. Okay, so what?
For
Sorry?
the Tuesday the 25th, what time is that?
Regular.
So
Oh, it is regular time.
Okay.
It's just changed the schedule because of Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
That's Thanksgiving week, so they're making us do class on Tuesday. Just special. All right? Yeah.
Are we getting more information about what's happening with the DC Day trip in terms of interviews?
Yeah.
Okay, because I was like,
Yeah. So your background paper is 30th, right? So at that point, you will have a sense of, and can I also say, if you really don't know where you're going with this and the explanation in the syllabus is not enough, come see me. Students often find that useful. So, background paper is going to tell you sort of where you've been in this policy arena and then where you are right now. Remember, you really have to put the blinders on in terms of picking a policy proposal up to that point. Okay, those two pieces are, you're trying to get the lay of the land so that you can make a very educated, sort of proposal that reflects what's going on historically and what's going on right now. Okay? So once you finish your background paper, you really should have a decent sense of, oh, okay, I see where the hole is, or I see where the opportunity is, I see where the window might be, I see what particular policy issue I'm going to look at. And at that point, you can start thinking about who you want to interview. Right? So it's really, like, you probably don't know that yet, but you will soon. Okay? And so by the time you talk to Dr. Shogun, you should have some kernel of an idea that you can flesh out. And then by the following week, ideally definitely before the following week, by October 30th, you want to give people 2 weeks to ask them if they can do this. That's a fair. So you have to move fairly quickly. Okay? Katie should be giving you details on the sort of the logistics of the trip. As I recall, you leave at around 7 in the morning. You get to Union Station around 10:30. You have your first, 10. You have your first interview probably at 11. That interview lasts an hour. You meet for somewhere at lunch at 12:30. That gives you time to do 1, if not 2 interviews in the afternoon. Katie is setting up interviews because there are people on the bus who are not in the class, so therefore they're not doing interviews. So she is setting up interviews that you might actually be interested in doing. So you could do 1 interview for class and then do another 1 or 2 that she sets up, or you could do 2 interviews for class. It's really up to you. You do need to post something. That's part of that thing in the syllabus. I think it's 5% of the class or something. You need to post something about who you interviewed and how that was useful. Like, I don't necessarily need to see in the final proposal, sort of quotes from the person, although if you want to do that, that's absolutely fine. But it's really an informal, you're supposed to be getting information from them. Is this a good idea? What would you suggest? That's the point of the...
But it says here we post on November 13th. Aren't we going on the 14th?
Oh, yeah, that's right, we changed, this was supposed to be the 6th. So, it's the day after, does that make sense, or the week?
15th?
So it'll be the 19th, or something like that? It was the day before this next class, so we'll do it the day before that class.
No, so 19th. Okay.
Yeah. So the 19th. So we are in day 2 of the theory, and so I had a good question that I was actually going to answer today. So 2 things. What do you need to have reference to these theories in any of your papers, and how will this material be evaluated by my staff? Remember that the papers are being written for not an academic audience. It's a policy audience, right? It's probably like your chief of staff, right? Or your senator. They do not care about John Kingdon. But I want to see that you have absorbed these theories and that your, obviously the streams analysis, that's all John Kingdon. So if you have a good understanding of Kingdon, that will be reflected in that paper. In the proposal, a lot of the theory that we're going to talk about today should inform your proposal. Okay, so are you thinking about the politics? Are you thinking about social construction? Are you thinking about when there is a punctuation or a window? Okay, so the ideas are useful. And that's the point, is that in a couple of years, if you find yourself on the Hill, these theories will actually be useful to you. So I don't need you to say, well, according to advocacy coalition theory, blah, 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 because that's not what we want. But I want to see that you've used the tools. Okay? On the exam, this review session, I will break you up into groups, probably by, I don't know how many classes, but some division of actual classes. The groups will come up with questions that you think would make very good final exam questions, and you will create a study document that you can all use. Okay, so, and I will come around and say, that's a terrible question, or I will say, wow, I should use that question. I won't say that, probably. All right? I think the door is painted shut, or I would open it, but it's warm. Anything else about the next few weeks? All good? Again, if at any point between now and proposal, or now and Colleen Shogun, you feel like you need more to get some sense of who you want to be interviewing, make an appointment to come see me. I'm happy to walk you through that. Okay? Is there anything else? Not. Okay. So, you'll see a pattern here. A lot of the theoretical models, starting with Kingdon, all work within the assumption that the policymaking world is divided into subsystems. Right, so remember Kingdon looked at transportation and healthcare. So, starting several decades ago, there was this understanding that all of these people work in these very somewhat closed communities, and they don't really interact with each other. Okay, and so if you're trying to figure out what's going on with transportation policy, or what's going on with policy making, you know, sort of writ large, you can't really answer that question, but maybe if you look at one of the subsystems, you can. So, different authors have called them different things. So we're going to start with iron triangles. I'll give you a minute. Can someone describe what they're seeing here and how it might make sense? Anything? No.
Any one of the three would be relevant
Okay, but let's step back a little bit. So on the three corners, are in this model are the three basically only players in this model. Okay, so you have the interest group. Give me an example of interest group. So fracking, so it would be like Enviro.
Generally.
So yeah, so high-tech firms, Enviro. So you know, sort of the bigger, not just one organization, but the interest groups that represent that sort of whatever that policy area. And it's still, remember, it's still a subsystem, right? So then the bureaucratic agency. So if we're talking about Enviro, who's a bureaucratic agency? EPA, something like that, right? There are a couple of them. So there may be more than one, but they're all sort of still pretty limited. And then there's whatever relevant congressional committees and subcommittees. So the major actors in this system are the members of Congress, or the senators, the people who are interested in whatever that policy arena is, and the people who regulate that policy arena. Okay, so those are the three corners. What about these arrows? What does this mean? Why do the arrows go both ways?
Well, for example, with the money support, the committees may decide how much money a certain policy initially gets, but then an interest group can also try to sway and influence that amount.
Right, so the arrows go both ways because they all rely on each other. Right, it's a very interdependent kind of relationship where the interest groups give them money to get reelected, right? The committees do stuff that these guys like, right? There's all relationships. The agencies have policies that they regulate that are obviously important to them, right? So it's a very tight circle or triangle. So I'll give you an example. So the Tennessee Valley in 1933 was a pretty rough place to be. About 30% of people had malaria. Poverty was very, very high. Land erosion was terrible. Soil depletion was terrible. All those sort of farming practices were very, very backwards. No power, not great water, as you can see. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, the idea was to modernize the region. And probably one of the most important things they wanted to do was bring cheap, universal power, electricity. Okay? I mean, in addition, they trained farmers, farmers on the, correct uses of fertilizer and that kind of stuff, but cheap power was the big deal. And that's what was going to cost a lot of money. So, who likes this idea of cheap power?
Coal industry?
What?
Coal industry?
Coal? Well, actually, the local power companies don't love this idea because that's their business, right? And so if you're sort of taking their business away from them. So the power companies are actually the ones that are not in love with this idea. The people who love this idea at the outset are basically poor people, right? The Tennessee Valley Authority was having a lot of trouble. Private sector utility companies didn't like the idea, and so they were not getting a lot of traction. So what they did was they basically changed their triangle. Who else might like cheap power that might be useful in this case?
Businesses?
Okay,
Congressmen who want to get elected?
so what they did, the interest group before they rethought this were poor people. It's not helpful. So they changed it to agriculture, farmers who are crazy about cheap power, right? And they have a particularly strong relationship with Southern members of Congress. So all of a sudden you created a relationship that helps everyone. TDA's happy, AG's happy, ultimately TDA's happy because in addition they're actually doing what they want to do, which is help poor people and stabilize the region. The members of Congress are happy. So that's an example of an iron triangle, and I think it describes that policy arena pretty well. So how accurately do you think iron triangles describe policy making generally? It's not pink eye, is it?
Oh, it is.
Seriously?
Yeah.
And you're here?
I'm here.
I'm not impressed by that.
Not making out with
Nice. All right. How accurately do you think it describes policy making?
policy making.
Yeah. How accurately do you think this describes how it happens on a regular basis? Maybe it. Maybe is an okay answer. Sometimes it's an okay answer.
It kind of makes sense, it's missing kind of the executive.
Okay. It's missing some parts.
Yeah, it definitely is, yeah.
It's missing some parts. As I said, in the TDA case, it's actually pretty decent explanation. Yes, ma'am?
I was gonna say another thing, is that sometimes different corners of the triangle might have a disproportionate amount of power. So, you know, maybe it'll be a different type of triangle.
Yeah.
Depending on the situation.
Yeah. It's probably more accurate when you're talking about a smaller, less contested policy area that doesn't get a lot of public attention. That's probably how it works. But in a lot of policy arenas, there are more actors, there's more going on, there's more complexity. Yeah.
To me, this is more about what brings something to the forefront of the agenda. We were talking about the streams previously.
Uh-huh.
Like if you have these three aspects of this triangle,
almost like a window?
it's probably going to come, the window's going to open itself. So to speak.
Okay. So the iron triangle is really closed. That's sort of its defining characteristic. Also, the perception of it is that it's very stable, right? It's like, these are the groups. They don't really change, right? And in fact, in a lot of cases, they do change. So Advocacy Coalition Framework, ACF, sort of takes iron triangles and expands it a little bit. So this theoretical construct actually comes from a couple of ideas that we've talked about already. Bounded rationality. So we understand this model takes as given that we can't process all the information and that we use heuristics to help us make decisions. Right? That's the idea behind bounded rationality, which we already talked about. It was last week we talked about prospect theory, where actors tend to remember or not like losses more than gains. So this is also based on the idea of prospect theory, where there's an idea that comes out of ACF that I don't know that it's the most popular idea, but it's called the devil shift. And the idea is that the coalitions are sort of competing with one another, and so the one that can make the other one look worse wins, which is why they call it the devil shift. They're trying to make their counterpart look like the devil. So that's kind of prospect theory, right? That, you know, if it's you're taking advantage of the fact that people don't like loss. So these are the main ideas behind ACF. So the technical information bit, why does that matter? Technical information is really important. You can't really influence policymaking within a subsystem unless you have a pretty good handle on, you know, sort of the bits and pieces. What are the implications of that?
The legislative subsidy idea, like you need access to someone who has that deep technical information, and there are going to be people like in the kind of wider stream that aren't able to attain that level of.
Yeah, so if you want to make a difference in this policy arena, but you don't really have that technical expertise, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah.
The ACF, I think, is the first theory that really embraces this idea that policy change takes a decade or more. That's a pretty important idea. Why is that important? As a policy entrepreneur, why is that important?
Because it helps to manage expectations.
Yeah. And you have to understand that if you're gonna commit your resources, it's for the long haul, right? It's not gonna happen, if you remember, like death tax, it's not gonna happen in a matter of a couple of years. The focus on the policy subsystem, which is by now pretty universal. The important part of ACF is different from Iron Triangle, is that there are all these different actors. So, different levels of government. Consultants, lobbyists, scientists, the media. And then this last point, policies and programs are essentially a reflection of a belief system. And we're going to talk about that belief system in a second, because that's probably, for me, it's probably the most important idea behind ACF. So here's the model. So again, we're talking about a subsystem. So there are stable parameters, and then there are these external events. So the idea here is that there are all kinds of things that are really important that happen inside the system, inside this subsystem, but they're not immune to what happens outside. So you have to think about the politics. You have to think about, sort of national mood and some of that stuff that Kingdon talks about. The stable parameters are the stuff that we talked about earlier in the semester, things that aren't easily changed, like sort of the structure of our government. And then ACF identifies a number of ways, and we're going to sort of come back to this a couple of times today, that policy change happens. So you might have some external shock, okay? Maybe like if you're thinking about Kingdon, like a focusing event. You might have policy-oriented learning, which the chapter you read for class today talks about, so I'll leave that to that. And then the internal shocks and negotiated agreements are also in your chapter, so we'll leave that for the chapter discussion. Okay, so the shared beliefs. I think your chapter only talks about policy core and secondary, which is weird. I liked the case, but I thought that was a particularly weird thing. So you might want to ignore what they had to say about beliefs. So according to ACF, the most central of these three belief systems are these deep core beliefs. These are fundamental, normative, non-changing ideas about how the world should be. Okay? The role of government. It's really hard to change someone's idea on that. Right? So these are the things that I sort of believe in my heart are true. Okay? This contrasts with policy core beliefs. So, policy core beliefs are sort of the fundamental glue of coalitions. It's how you get strange bedfellows. Because you don't necessarily have to share deep core beliefs to share policy core beliefs. Anybody think of an example of that? Yes, ma'am.
The biofuels policy, you had some environmentalists who thought that it was better for the environment, and then you also had people in the industry who just liked it because it made more money for them.
Right. Give me another example.
I was going to say the Chamber of Commerce support for immigration reform.
Okay, so on immigration, who wants immigration reform? The Chamber of Commerce. Why do they want it? Cheap labor. Who else wants immigration reform?
Also high talent labor, not just cheap labor.
Two kinds. Farmers, cheap labor. High-tech firms, talent labor. Pro-immigrant groups,